Hello, my name is Jackie Goodway, and I'm honored to be an NAK Fellow. I'm going to talk to you today about my work in promoting physical literacy in preschoolers who are disadvantaged. So, how is it that some children have negative developmental trajectories while others go on to be active throughout their lifespan? My research foci are focused around three broad themes. The first is the relationship between motor competence and physical activity, particularly looking at the developmental trajectory model that I helped to develop along with Dave Stodden. Second area is looking at global developmental delays in fundamental motor skills. And the primary area of my research are early childhood motor skill interventions. I'm going to speak to the latter in this presentation. My research is informed by physical literacy, the developmental trajectory model, and dynamic systems and Newell's constraints. I'm interested in supporting young vulnerable children aged between 3 and 8 years of age from underserved communities. I take a developmental perspective on everything that I do thanks to my training at Michigan State University, and I'm particularly interested in the foundations and the fundamentals of physical literacy. My work around SKIP, which stands for Successful Kinesthetic Instruction for Preschoolers, has a variety of studies. We've looked at baseline motor competence studies. We've looked at expert-led SKIP studies. We've looked at SKIP studies with teachers, and we have a number of playground studies. I'm going to share a few of these in this presentation. One of the things I think I'm most concerned about right now is the global developmental delays I see across the world. I first became aware of these developmental delays in my early work at Michigan State University. When I worked in Flint, Michigan, and I started looking at the motor competence of young children, I found that the children were developmentally delayed in their locomotor and their object control skills. There were no gender differences for locomotor skills, but we did see sustained gender differences for object control skills, with girls being worse than boys. This slide shows the same study, but in a different context, now in a southwest suburb of Houston, Texas. And again, what we see are pretty significant developmental delays in preschoolers' locomotor and object control skills, with no differences for locomotor, but again, boys better than girls in object control skills. So essentially the same findings, but a different context. As we've looked at this across the last couple of decades, all of these arrows point to data where we found some similar findings. And so we're concerned from the United States standpoint that there are ongoing developmental delays in young children who are disadvantaged. We've also begun to look at this more recently across the globe, and in all of these countries, we have also found developmental delays in young children's fundamental motor skills, not only for those from disadvantaged backgrounds, but also those from more middle-income families. So why do we find consistent data on low motor competence in children? We certainly don't have any causal data, but increasing attention is being paid to the lack of support for physical literacy in poor neighborhoods, and also to the social cultural factors influencing family dynamics, and particularly the ecological niches around physical activity. In a qualitative study of 59 disadvantaged families, we went to their homes and we talked to predominantly mothers and interviewed them about what was going on at home. And we came up with 5 main themes. The first theme dealt with the fact the outside environment is safe, and many of the mothers said there's nowhere for their children to play. Inside, we found that parents, and particularly mothers, talked about promoting sedentary behaviors such as screen time due to small spaces and multiple families living in one place. From a poverty standpoint, many of these families could not afford physical activity for their children, and the nature of family dynamics meant that mom was working multiple jobs and children were raising each other. So again, there was no support for our children to play. I think what is important to note is that parents valued the importance of moving, but could not make the physical activity happen in their environment. We then look to the places where our children spend most of their time, either in the Head Start centers or early childhood centers. And as we looked at the literature, and both in the centers that we collaborated with, we found that these were also not good environments for our children to be active. Center policies did not promote motor competence and often limited movement. Classroom teachers were not prepared in their training to be able to teach movement and physical education. And often the gross motor spaces that were available in the centers were just not well set up for the kinds of movement we know is important. Also, many of the teachers believe that if they kick kids out onto the playground, those fundamental motor skills would naturally develop and children would naturally be active. So we started looking at some playground studies and wondered how active are children on the playground and what role does motor competence play in accounting for who is active and who is inactive. We found that 42% of the time on the playground children were sedentary and only 36% of time was spent in MVPA. As might be expected, boys are more active than girls, but what was interesting to us was that fundamental motor skill competence and perceptions of competence significantly predicted 43% of the variance in MVPA on the playground after controlling for age, sex, and BMI. So children who were more competent and had higher perceived motor competence were more active. And we believe, as do many who are probably listening to this, that maybe improving fundamental motor skill competence and perceptions of competence may be a mechanism to increase physical activity on the playground. So 25 years ago, I instituted my first SKIP program. I was pretty clueless and working in Flint, Michigan, and just hoping that I could make a difference. Over the last 25 years, we've learned a lot about intervening with young children from a motor skills standpoint. Our SKIP learning outcomes align with physical literacy. There are a number around physical competence, with one of the big ones being promoting fundamental motor skill competence. We're also interested in enhancing their knowledge and understanding of their body and movement principles. We believe that motivation, confidence, and enjoyment are critical, and so we improve individual perceptions of motor competence, and we try to promote personal responsible behaviors and make our tasks fun and challenging. And then in addition, within SKIP, we believe in wrapping around engagement and physical activities for life. So parent-child activities for the home, camouflage activities at school, and an overall appreciation of being a mover and wanting to move. Our SKIP content areas include locomotor and object control skills, non-locomotor skills, movement concepts, and fitness. So this graph shows some of the early data we first collected on SKIP 25 years ago. This data came out of Flint and was a result of a 12-week intervention that met twice a week for 45 minutes. As you can see, both the experimental and the control groups, so the SKIP group and the comparison group, were developmentally delayed in their locomotor and object control skills prior to the intervention. But following the intervention, the SKIP children went from developmentally delayed to actually advanced in their motor skills, whereas the comparison group remained developmentally delayed. A few years later, we conducted some work down in Houston. This time it was a 9-week intervention, twice a week for 30 minutes. And we found some similar findings. Again, the skip group significantly improved their locomotor and their object control skills, going from delayed to typically developing, while the comparison group did not improve at all. Not only did the children improve their fundamental motor skills, they knew that they had improved them. And we saw a significant increase in perceptions of motor competence as a result of the work that we had done with them and the skip intervention. As we began to think through skip a little more extensively, we began to look at low autonomy and high autonomy environments that were either teacher-centered or more mastery, motivational, climate, and child-centered. This work was Leah Robinson's dissertation under my mentorship, and what we see here is that the skip group significantly improved from pre-test to post-test, and they dropped off a little bit at the retention test, but when we looked at pre-test to retention test, we still saw significant improvements. So overall, we looked at both here, low autonomy and high autonomy groups, and we found that both instructional climates significantly improved object control skills in compared to the comparison group who did not improve. So from an expert standpoint, experts had led all of these skip studies, and we have more than that we could share with you. And we certainly found that we could bring about significant improvements in our skip children as a result of the skip program. Our comparison children were involved in well-equipped free play, and they were flatliners, as we called them, and they had no changes in their fundamental motor skills. And so we were very concerned about them. However, we got to the point where we just went, there's only so many researchers who can do this. So now it's time to see if we can translate this work into the preschools and train teachers to deliver skip. So along with Ali Bryan and Rory Familia, two of my former doctoral students, we began to skip with early childhood teachers. And we started educating early childhood teachers to deliver skip. I don't have time to get into all of the training that we did with them, but it was very practice-based and focused around stages and nuance constraints. In Ali's dissertation work, we found that the T-skip, so the teachers skip children significantly improved across the intervention, whereas the comparison children actually dropped off in their performance of fundamental motor skills a little bit. We got a little smarter about our analysis and started running hierarchical linear modeling, and you can see the data here showing that there's a clear difference for the T-skip children as compared to the comparison children. At the same time this work was going on, we also were working in Wales. One of my colleagues in Wales, Dr. Nalda Wainwright, has the Wales Institute for Physical Literacy. And we started doing some grassroots work in Wales, training teachers in skip and teaching them how to deliver motor skills within their regular school day. We learned a lot about how to work with teachers, both the things that worked and didn't work. And our teachers reported feeling a lot of anxiety about working in a movement environment as compared to a regular classroom. But what was interesting was as our teachers began to deliver skip in their schools, not only did we see positive impact on motor skills, but we began to see these cascading effects of skip cumry. And so we might train a couple of teachers in a school, but more teachers would come to the next training. And in some cases, the outcomes were so dramatic that the headmistress of the school would shut down their school and invite us in to train all teachers in Skip Cymru so that all children in their school could actually be involved. We also learned through this work about how to build in academic content into our Skip lessons. Another one of my doctoral students, who was actually an early childhood reading interventionist, started working with me, and she designed an integrated motor skill program that looked at both alphabet knowledge, initial sound awareness, and fundamental motor skills. So essentially teaching reading literacy skills through movement. Tricia was able to bring about not only significant improvements in locomotor and object control skills as a result of her integrated intervention, but also improve phonological awareness and alphabet recognition. This was particularly important because it was in a low-income Head Start, and these children not only were low in their motor skills, were very low in their initial literacy scores. At the same time, we started working in Indonesia along with Dr. Ruri Familia, and we looked at the effectiveness as an 8-week Indo-Skip motor skill program on children's motor competence and perceptions of competence and executive function. It was no surprise to us that these children were developmentally delayed at the initial level, but they had high perceptions of their motor competence, so they felt pretty good about their perceptions of both their physical competence and their motor skill competence. We then implemented the 8-week Indo-Skip program, and we found that we were able to increase fundamental motor skill competence as a result of the Skip intervention. Interestingly, we used both the TDMD and the movement ABC, and we did not yield significant pre-post-test tests in the movement ABC, which I think speaks to the importance of selecting an appropriate instrument when we design our studies. Not only did Indo-Skip improve motor skills, it also improved executive function, and we were able to bring about some significant changes in the day-night test, which is a measure of inhibitory control. So overall in Indo-Skip, they were significantly better at object control skills, improved their perceptions of competence, had better executive function. And as we measured fidelity, the teachers could actually deliver the Indo-Skip intervention with fidelity. So as we kind of took a step back and looked at what we've learned from all of this, I would say a couple of things. Tasks act as powerful constraints, and tasks matter. We have spent the last 25 years designing really good tasks that constrain movement and create the kind of movement we desire, that also motivate children to engage in multiple trials and is intrinsically rewarding. As much as the tasks matter, the teachers matter too. Teachers need to be knowledgeable in the developmental stages of fundamental motor skills, and they need to understand the importance of their role, particularly pedagogically, as they work with children in the environment. The group that I'm most concerned about are our typical preschool children who had business as usual, which typically consisted of sort of supervised free play on the playground. These children remain developmentally delayed and are much greater at risk for a negative spiral of disengagement, higher percentage of sedentary behaviors, and a likelihood to be overweight and potentially obese. We certainly need more longitudinal work to examine. So going back to our physical literacy model and looking at those 4 pillars of physical literacy, motor competence is critical and needs to be developed early in childhood. For many children who grow up in disadvantaged communities, their context does not support motor competence, and we need to find ecologically valid places where we can intervene with them and get them on an early start to their physical literacy journey. It is clear that there are disparities in movement opportunities for children, and we need to look carefully at gender and socioeconomic status and also disability and make sure that we address these in our physical activity policies and practices. Like the iceberg, there's still so much we don't know. There are continuing assessment struggles, particularly in capturing the more holistic issue around physical literacy. We need many more longitudinal studies to determine if we bump these children early, do they stay on the mountain of motor development and continue to be active and more physically literate? And how much of motor competence is enough to get them into a positive spiral of engagement? We also need to look at our parents and how our children export their knowledge and motivation to be active and how that impacts our families, and certainly principles for teacher training. I have not been on this journey alone. I would certainly like to acknowledge my amazing academic kids who have really pushed me and made me think carefully about all that I do, and my fabulous collaborators who I couldn't do this work without you. I would also like to acknowledge my husband Scott, my daughter Blaze, and my two puppies who put up with the missing mom and the many hours of work that I put in around this work. Certainly, they are the rock that keeps me going and makes me feel supported. So thank you for an opportunity to share this work with you.